3 months earlier, September 1944, Fort Bliss, Texas. James Edward Mitchell enlisted in the United States Army on his 19th birthday. Not out of patriotism, not out of heroism, but because there was nothing left for him at home. His father's farm in Nebraska was failing. The land was tired, the money was gone, and 3 of his older brothers were already overseas. James was the youngest. Growing up near Lincoln, he spent his childhood in marshlands and open fields, hunting ducks and geese at dawn, learning to move quietly, learning to watch, learning to wait. He learned how wind altered a shot, how distance deceived the eye, how a moving target was never where it appeared to be. No one called it training, no one thought it was special. It was just life. When James arrived at Fort Bliss, the Army saw another civilian replacement, one of thousands being rushed through training to replace the catastrophic casualties of D-Day and the European campaign. Anti-aircraft training before the war had lasted 17 weeks. By late 1944, it had been cut to 8. 8 weeks to turn teenagers into gunners capable of shooting down aircraft traveling hundreds of miles per hour. The failure rate was brutal. Nearly 1 in 4 trainees washed out. Those who failed weren't sent home. They were reassigned to infantry or artillery units, often a death sentence in a manpower-starved army. The man responsible for shaping these recruits was Technical Sergeant Robert Hansen, a veteran of North Africa who had personally shot down 3 German aircraft. On the first day, Hansen didn't offer encouragement, he offered the truth. The life expectancy of an anti-aircraft crew under sustained attack, he said, is about 45 minutes. Not 45 minutes of war, 45 minutes once the enemy decides you need to die. You shoot until your barrels melt, Hansen continued, until you run out of ammunition or until you're dead. Nobody laughed. Most of the recruits struggled. They watched training films of aircraft moving at 300 miles per hour, and their minds froze. To hit a plane, you don't aim where it is, you aim where it will be, seconds into the future, accounting for speed, distance, altitude, and angle all at once. Get it wrong by 30 feet, and you miss. Mitchell didn't struggle. While others tried to calculate, he felt it. His years of hunting had already taught him how to lead a target instinctively, how to trust his eyes, how to read movement instead of numbers. By week 6, instructors noticed. Mitchell ranked among the top 5 gunners in his company. They noted his unusually fast target acquisition and calm under pressure. When he graduated on November 12, 1944, he received orders within hours. Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. Immediate overseas deployment. The Army thought it had trained him to watch the sky. It never imagined he would be watching the ground.
January 17, 1945, Bastogne, Belgium. The cold that night was not just uncomfortable, it was lethal. Minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold so deep it felt solid, pressing against the skin, seeping into bone. In the frozen darkness, a single American soldier sat alone. Private James Edward Mitchell was 19 years old. He sat behind an M51 Quad 50 anti-aircraft gun, a weapon capable of firing 2,000 rounds per minute, designed for one purpose only, to destroy enemy aircraft screaming across the sky at impossible speeds. But there was nothing in the sky. No engines, no bombers, no fighters. Only silence. Mitchell's fingers, stiff with cold, wrapped around the gun's controls. He had been trained on this weapon for exactly 6 days before being shipped overseas. He had never fired it in combat. His official duty was simple: watch the sky and wait for orders. At 3:20 a.m., he heard something. Not above him, from the ground. A faint mechanical sound, metal brushing against metal, movement. Careful, deliberate, close. What happened next would violate every rule he had been taught, every principle of American anti-aircraft doctrine, every expectation of what a 19-year-old private was allowed to decide. Without orders, without authorization, without knowing whether he was about to save lives or destroy his own career forever, James Mitchell lowered the barrels of an anti-aircraft gun toward the ground and pressed the firing pedal. For the next 15 seconds, Bastogne erupted in gunfire. When the sound stopped, more than 80 enemy soldiers lay dead. A major German assault had been destroyed before it began, and a single accidental decision had quietly reshaped military doctrine for the next 70 years. But none of that was supposed to happen, and no one, not the Germans, not American commanders, not military planners, had ever imagined that it could.
Conversational, psychological narration. Mid-December 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. When James Mitchell arrived in Belgium, the war had already turned desperate. German forces had launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, what history would later call the Battle of the Bulge. American units were scattered, supply lines were broken, entire divisions were being swallowed by snow, confusion, and constant artillery fire. Bastogne mattered. It was a road junction. 7 major roads converged there. If the Germans took it, American defenses in the region would collapse. So they surrounded it. Mitchell was assigned to Battery B, 796th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, a unit equipped with 4 Quad 50 mounts, positioned around the town's perimeter. Officially, their mission was simple: defend against air attacks. In reality, Bastogne was a siege. American forces were completely encircled. Food was rationed, ammunition was scarce, medical supplies ran dangerously low. Resupply depended entirely on the weather, and the weather was brutal. Temperatures plunged well below zero. Frostbite claimed as many men as enemy fire. Sleep came in short, exhausted fragments between artillery barrages. The anti-aircraft crews adapted however they could. During the day, they scanned the sky. At night, they watched the tree line. They fired at German fighters attacking supply planes. They provided emergency ground support when infantry came under attack. They listened, constantly, for anything that sounded wrong. Mitchell's section was commanded by Sergeant First Class William Barnes. Barnes was a professional soldier. He'd enlisted before the war, fought in North Africa, survived Sicily, seen enough combat to know when things were going bad. When Mitchell arrived, Barnes didn't pretend otherwise. "You're the second assistant gunner I've had this week. The first one got hit by artillery 2 days ago." Barnes looked at the 19-year-old and spoke plainly. "We're surrounded. They're throwing everything at us. You do your job, stay alert, and maybe we both make it out of here." Mitchell's first week at Bastogne shattered every illusion he had about combat. The shelling never stopped. Sleep was a luxury. Fear became background noise. On December 23rd, the clouds finally broke. C-470 transport planes roared overhead, dropping food, ammunition, and medical supplies. German fighters followed. Battery B opened fire. Red tracer rounds climbed into the sky. Mitchell fed ammunition belts into the gun, watching the air fill with fire. Then he saw it. One of the German fighters trailing smoke, spiraling downward. "Did we hit him?" Mitchell shouted. Barnes lowered his binoculars. "That's a kill. Keep feeding the belts." The plane crashed miles outside the perimeter. Mitchell felt something twist in his stomach. Excitement, shock, and the sudden realization that he had helped kill another human being. By
January 16th, 1945. Evening, Bastogne. By Bastogne standards, the night was quiet. No major ground attacks, no air raids, only distant artillery, the constant, dull thunder that never truly stopped. Sergeant Barnes organized the guard rotation carefully. "Mitchell," he said, "you take 0200 to 400. The deadest hours of the night, the time when exhaustion hits hardest, when vigilance fades, when mistakes are made. At 0:45 hours, Torres shook Mitchell awake inside the frozen dugout. "Your turn. Nothing happening. Quiet night." He paused. "Stay awake. Barnes will have your ass if you fall asleep on guard." Mitchell climbed out into darkness so complete it felt solid. The temperature was -15 Fahrenheit. His breath crystallized instantly in the air. Starlight barely illuminated the snow-covered ground. Visibility was maybe 20 yards. Beyond that, nothing. Only the black outline of trees at the forest's edge. He settled into the gunner's seat, hands gripping the controls, forcing himself to stay alert. The doctrine for anti-aircraft guard duty was clear. Watch the sky, listen for aircraft engines, alert the crew immediately if you hear anything. Do not fire without orders. Under no circumstances engage ground targets. Mitchell knew the rules. He had been trained on them, tested on them, corrected when he got them wrong. The problem was the silence. Minutes stretched into eternity. The cold crept deeper into his body. His eyes burned from staring into nothing. Every instinct screamed for sleep. At 03:15 hours, he heard it. Not an engine. Something else. A faint metallic sound. Metal brushing against metal. From the direction of the forest. Mitchell leaned forward, straining to listen. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't tanks. It was too soft, too close. He rubbed his eyes. Exhaustion could play tricks. Every soldier knew that. Then he heard it again. Clearer this time. Movement. Multiple sources. Slow. Careful. Deliberate. His training said, ignore it. His instincts said, pay attention. Years of hunting in Nebraska flooded back. Animals didn't move like that unless they were stalking or trying not to be seen. Something was out there. Something human. Mitchell's hands tightened on the gun grips. Standard procedure was to wake Sergeant Barnes immediately. But what if he was wrong? What if it was nothing, just exhaustion and imagination? False alarms got people yelled at. They eroded trust. They marked you as someone who panicked.
January 17th, 1945. 03:20 hours. Bastogne. Mitchell's mind raced. The shapes were moving faster now, leaving the cover of the trees, crossing open ground. In seconds, they would be inside the American perimeter. Every rule he had learned screamed the same command. Wake Sergeant Barnes, report the contact, request flares, follow procedure. That was how the Army worked. That was how mistakes were avoided. That was how responsibility was shared. But procedures took time, and time was something Mitchell no longer had. He tried to count the figures moving across the snow. 10, 20, more. They moved low, deliberately, using the darkness as cover. These were not lost soldiers, not patrols, not supply details. This was an infiltration. Mitchell felt the same sensation he had felt as a boy when something moved through tall grass just out of sight, when instinct warned of danger before the eyes confirmed it. His heart pounded. If he was wrong, he would face court-martial. If he was right and hesitated, people would die. He thought of Barnes asleep in the dugout, of Torres, of the exhausted infantrymen scattered around the perimeter, barely holding on after weeks of combat. There would be no second chance. Mitchell made his decision. Slowly, deliberately, he rotated the controls. The barrels of the Quad 50 lowered, not toward the sky, toward the ground. He centered the simple ring-and-post sight on the moving shapes, adjusting for distance the way he had adjusted for birds in flight years before. No calculations, no conscious math, just instinct. Without orders, without authorization, without any certainty that what he was doing was correct, Private James Edward Mitchell pressed the firing pedal.
The night exploded. 4 50-caliber Browning machine guns opened fire at once. The Quad 50 roared to life, unleashing nearly 2,000 rounds per minute into the frozen darkness. The recoil shook the mount violently. The sound was deafening, a solid, mechanical scream that tore through the silence of Bastogne. Tracers, 1 in every 5 rounds, streaked outward in brilliant red lines, cutting across the snow-covered ground at almost 3,000 feet per second. For the first time that night, the darkness was no longer dark. The battlefield lit up. The shapes Mitchell had targeted were no longer shadows. They were men. German infantry, dozens of them, caught in the open, moving directly toward American lines. The effect was immediate, apocalyptic. The 50-caliber rounds designed to tear apart aircraft traveling at supersonic speeds struck human bodies with a force that defied description. Each bullet carried nearly 1,800 foot-pounds of energy. At 300 yards, they barely slowed down. Men were thrown backward, equipment shattered, snow erupted into clouds of red and white. The German reconnaissance battalion had no cover, no time to react, no chance to escape. Mitchell held the trigger down. 5 seconds. 10. The gun hammered relentlessly, sweeping the open ground with controlled horizontal fire. Then suddenly, his mind caught up with his hands. He released the pedal. The silence that followed was unreal. 15 seconds. That was all it took. Mitchell stared at the devastation in front of him. "Oh, God," he whispered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "Oh, God, what did I do?" Behind him, a dugout door burst open. Sergeant First Class William Barnes stormed into the night, followed by Torres and Patterson. "What the hell are you shooting at?" Barnes shouted over the ringing in his ears. Mitchell turned, trembling, and pointed. "The ground," he said. Barnes raised his binoculars. The tracer.
Conversational psychological narration. The radio crackled to life. Torres's voice cut through the night, tight and urgent, as he reported the contact to battalion headquarters. Within minutes, the entire American sector was on alert. Orders echoed through the darkness. Shouts carried from foxhole to foxhole. Men scrambled to fighting positions. Then the flares went up. White light burst into the sky, drifting slowly downward on parachutes, bathing the snow-covered ground in a harsh, unforgiving glow. What the light revealed stunned even combat-hardened veterans. The open field between the forest and the American perimeter was littered with bodies. German soldiers lay where they had fallen, some motionless, some wounded, some desperately crawling back toward the tree line. Equipment was scattered everywhere. Weapons dropped mid-stride. Maps, radios, signal flares half buried in the snow. This hadn't been a probing patrol. It had been a full-scale infiltration. Over 80 German soldiers were already dead or dying. The survivors, shocked, disorganized, and suddenly visible, fled back into the forest, abandoning their mission entirely. Across the perimeter, American infantry stared in disbelief. They had been seconds away from being overrun in the dark. Barnes lowered his binoculars slowly. "They were going to cut us open," he said quietly, "right through the middle." The realization spread fast. This wasn't just a firefight. It was a stopped assault. A reconnaissance battalion had been caught in the open, its plan destroyed before it could even begin. And it had been stopped by a single anti-aircraft gun, firing at the ground. As dawn approached, battalion headquarters demanded answers, and James Mitchell was ordered to report immediately.
January 17th, 1945. Morning. Bastogne Battalion Headquarters. James Mitchell stood at attention. His uniform was still dusted with gunpowder residue. His hands shook slightly, from exhaustion, from cold,
or from what he knew was coming. Across the table stood Colonel Marcus Hayes, battalion commander. Hayes did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You violated every rule of anti-aircraft employment," he said calmly. "You fired a strategic air defense weapon at ground targets without authorization. You wasted ammunition. You compromised our anti-aircraft posture." Each sentence landed like a blow. "Do you understand that, Private?" "Yes, sir," Mitchell replied quietly. Hayes studied him for a long moment. In front of him were the reports, the casualty estimates, the maps recovered from the field. "You also detected an infiltration that trained sentries missed. You reacted faster than doctrine allowed. And you disrupted a German assault that intelligence now confirms involved over 1,500 troops supported by armor." The room erupted. Officers began talking at once. Intelligence demanded details. Operations wanted timelines. Someone mentioned medals. Hayes raised his hand. Silence returned instantly. "Here's what's going to happen."
January 18th, 1945. Bastogne. In a dim interrogation room near battalion headquarters, American intelligence officers questioned a captured German officer. He was SS Sturmbannführer Klaus Hoffmann, commander of the reconnaissance battalion that had attempted the night infiltration. Hoffmann was calm, professional, exhausted. He spoke in careful English. "We had infiltrated successfully," he said. "Your sentries were inattentive, some were asleep, others were exhausted." The American officers exchanged glances. "We were already inside your perimeter," Hoffmann continued, "preparing to signal the main assault force." That assault force, intelligence would later confirm, consisted of approximately 1,500 soldiers, supported by armor, waiting in the forest for the signal to attack. "Then," Hoffmann said, pausing briefly, "one of your anti-aircraft weapons opened fire at ground level." The room went silent. "The fire was devastating," Hoffmann continued. "We lost over 80 men in the first burst. The survivors scattered immediately." He shook his head slightly. "The plan depended entirely on surprise and speed. That moment destroyed both." An intelligence officer leaned forward. "How did you plan the infiltration?" Hoffmann answered without hesitation. "For 5 days my battalion studied your positions," he said. "We mapped sentry posts, identified patrol routes, noted weak points. We accounted for infantry fire, machine guns, mortars." Then he added the sentence that would echo far beyond Bastogne. "We never considered that someone would be watching the ground approach with an anti-aircraft weapon." He looked genuinely puzzled. "It was unexpected, impossible to plan for." That single sentence confirmed everything. Mitchell hadn't just stopped an attack. He'd done something the enemy believed was unthinkable, and that realization was about to travel far beyond the frozen fields of Belgium.
Late January 1945. News of what had happened at Bastogne spread fast, not through newspapers, not through official communiques, but through whispers. Every anti-aircraft crew in the division heard about it within days. The gunner who fired at the ground and stopped an entire German assault. By January 20th, the story had reached 3rd Army headquarters. By the end of the month, it was being quietly discussed in training commands back in the United States. The numbers were impossible to ignore.
German casualties, over 80 killed in the first burst, more than 100 wounded or scattered. American casualties prevented. Conservative estimates placed the number at nearly 2,000 soldiers who would have been caught inside the perimeter during a night breakthrough. Intelligence analysis painted a grim picture. Had the infiltration succeeded, elements of the 5th 1st Parachute Infantry Regiment and the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment would likely have been overrun in chaotic night fighting. Entire defensive positions would have collapsed before reinforcements could respond. One accidental decision had prevented that outcome. At Fort Bliss, instructors studied the after-action reports carefully. Technical Sergeant Robert Hansen, Mitchell's original instructor, stared at the documents in disbelief. "Look at this," he said to another instructor. "A kid who's been on the gun less than a month, on his first night as primary gunner, detects something our doctrine says he shouldn't even be looking for. And he does it," Hansen added quietly, "by doing exactly what we told him never to do." The implication was uncomfortable. Anti-aircraft doctrine treated air defense and ground defense as separate worlds. Different weapons, different missions, different thinking. But Bastogne had proven something else. What if a weapon designed to engage fast-moving aircraft could also dominate ground approaches? What if the doctrine itself was incomplete? Those questions were no longer theoretical. They were written in blood on the snow outside Bastogne. February 1945. A single line was added to a revised training bulletin. It was short, almost easy to miss. In emergency conditions, anti-aircraft weapons may be employed against ground targets when conventional infantry defenses are insufficient. That sentence changed everything. The quad .50 caliber gun, once treated as a specialized air defense system, was officially reclassified as a dual-role weapon. Training manuals were quietly updated. Gunners were instructed not only to track aircraft, but to scan tree lines, road approaches, and likely infiltration routes. Firing tables were expanded. Ammunition allocation increased. The Bastogne incident was never named. There was no chapter titled James Mitchell, but the fingerprints were everywhere. By March, quad .50s were being repositioned around perimeters, not just to protect against aircraft, but to dominate open ground at night. In the Pacific Theater, Marines began using similar setups against Japanese infiltration tactics. In Europe, anti-aircraft units found themselves attached directly to infantry formations. The gun had changed, and so had the men behind it. Mitchell, meanwhile, returned to his position. No medal, no citation, no mention in official reports. But the looks he received were different now. Men nodded when they passed him. Officers listened when he spoke. He was no longer the kid on the AA gun. He was the man who had seen what others missed. And the war moved on.
Spring 1945. The war in Europe was ending. Columns of prisoners marched east. Cities fell without a fight. The guns slowly went silent. James Mitchell survived Bastogne. He survived the war. He went home quietly. There were no parades for him, no newspaper articles, no photographs. His name never appeared in history books. Years later, military historians would praise the Quad 50 as one of the most effective ground defense weapons of World War II. They would credit doctrine, training evolution, lessons learned in combat. But none of them would mention the young private standing behind a frozen gun in the dark, breaking the rules because something felt wrong. They would not mention how close an entire American line came to collapse, or how it didn't. Mitchell never spoke about Bastogne, not to his family, not to his children. When asked about the war, he simply said, "I did my job." And yet thousands of men went home alive because one night in January, someone chose to trust instinct over instructions. History remembers victories. It remembers generals. It remembers plans. But sometimes the difference between defeat and survival is one man, one decision, and a weapon pointed in the wrong direction. Fade to black.